My name is Olivia Warren. I'm 42, a senior urban planner in Denver, and as of last Thursday, apparently divorced in spirit, if not yet on paper. The moment it happened wasn't loud. No screaming, no fight, just an email. I was reviewing zoning. Proposals when the subject line pinged in. It's better this way. It was from my husband, Darren, who, according to the calendar magnet on our fridge, was supposed to be at a creative retreat in Oregon, working on his book. What I got, instead, was a short message that felt like a guillotine drop. I've transferred the inheritance from your mother into my personal account. The split makes more sense this way. No greeting, no explanation, just a crime dressed in casual justification. Attached to the email was a grainy photo. Darren, shirt unbuttoned halfway, holding a glass of Pinot Noir on a rustic deck beside a woman I didn't recognize. Tan, much younger, her bare feet on the railing like she lived there. Behind them, the Oregon sunset glowed, romantic and unbothered. The expression on Darren's face was unlike any I'd seen in years. Unburdened. He didn't look like a man who had just stolen $620,000 from the woman he'd shared a bed and a mortgage with for over a decade. He looked like someone who had finally thrown off his mask. I closed the laptop without saying a word. My hands were cold. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, stared out the back window at the patio Darren and I had rebuilt 3 summers ago. The string lights we hung were still tangled between the rafters. I remembered sanding each plank while he read Yelp reviews for outdoor grills. I remembered thinking, this is home. But now it just looked like a carefully designed set that had already served its final scene. That money, my mother's legacy, was more than a figure in a trust account. It was time. It was sacrifice. It was a promise. She raised me alone after cancer took my father, worked nights at the library, saved every dime. When she died, she left me everything and wrote in a note, "Use it to build something that will last." Darren used it to leave, and I stood in the middle of our perfect kitchen, holding water I couldn't swallow, realizing I hadn't just been robbed. I'd been rewritten. I didn't cry that night. I didn't scream or smash a wine glass or call my best friend to unravel the betrayal in real time. I just sat on the edge of the bed Darren and I used to share, the bed I now realized had become a stage for one person pretending and the other withdrawing. I stared at the corner where I kept the cedar box of my mother's letters, the ones she wrote before she died, always ending with, "Keep building, Liv." She meant buildings, of course, but also strength, identity, something no one could take. At least that's what I thought until now. The truth is, I had been caring for her alone in her final 2 years, bathing her, feeding her, reading poetry aloud when the chemo blurred her eyes. Darren had shown up for a handful of hospital visits, always checking his watch, always offering to grab coffee for the nurses. He didn't love her. Not really. He loved the idea of being the kind of man who could say, "I was there for my wife's mother." But presence and participation are not the same thing, and she knew that. Before she passed, she told me softly, "Be careful with people who only show up when it's convenient." I should have listened harder. In the months after her death, Darren avoided any mention of the inheritance. Money made him uneasy, at least when it wasn't his. He called it cold, sterile, like it had no soul. But a few months ago, he changed. It started small, asking questions about where the funds were held, what kind of accounts they sat in, whether we'd diversified. I remember thinking it was odd, but I wanted to believe he was stepping up, taking interest. We'd always kept things separate but open. I had no reason to suspect theft. Not from the man who once stayed up all night to help me redraft an urban green space proposal because my laptop crashed the day before submission. Looking back, that wasn't love. That was performance. And he'd gotten really good at it. The deeper betrayal wasn't the money. It was what the theft told me. About him, about us, about how long he'd been fading out while I clung to what we used to be. I saw it in the way he dodged questions, in how he stopped touching me without reason, in the forced enthusiasm when I won the city contract for the new revitalization plan. "That's amazing," he'd said, eyes already back on his phone. "Can you send me the details later?" That's when it started unraveling in my head, like a spool pulled too tight. Darren had watched me carry my mother to her final breath. He knew what that money meant. It wasn't just inheritance. It was her legacy, her voice, her belief in what I could build, and he'd looked at that and decided it was his to take. That wasn't confusion. That wasn't desperation. That was contempt. And I was done mistaking it for love. I didn't scream, but I did prepare. Months. Before Darren ever sent that email, before the wine glass, before the blurry photo of him and his new life, I had already started moving in silence. Call it intuition, call it pattern recognition, call it years of watching men like Darren underestimate the quiet ones. Whatever it was, I knew something didn't feel right when he started asking about the exact structure of the inheritance. Not just how much, but where, what type of account, and who could access it in an emergency. That last part especially. Who asks about emergency access to someone else's legacy? So I took a long lunch from work and drove straight to the law firm my mother had trusted for decades, Wallace & Carr. Rita, the senior partner who had handled my mother's estate, met me with a knowing calm. I told her everything, not dramatic. Just the facts. She nodded slowly, then said 7 words that shifted the entire ground beneath me. "Let's make it legally untouchable for now." By the end of that week, the entire inheritance had been moved into an irrevocable trust, one with multiple layers of legal protection. My name was the only one on it. No spousal access, no co-ownership. Rita ensured every attempt to breach it would trigger an alert and leave a digital footprint. Then I went further. I hired a cybersecurity consultant, quietly, to install a monitoring system tied to all joint accounts and shared devices. Any unusual activity, logins, transfer attempts, file exports, would be logged and sent to a private cloud folder Darren didn't know existed. I didn't accuse. I didn't confront. I just waited. And when it happened, when the email hit and he pulled the trigger on what he thought was a clean digital heist, I didn't need to chase him. I already had him. In that secure folder were 3 months of evidence, screenshots of account balances being checked at odd hours, exports of financial documents, photos of paper notes Darren had scribbled transfer steps on, left carelessly in the home office trash. There was even a copy of a lease agreement tied to a small apartment in Oregon, listed under his name alone. The withdrawals from our joint accounts weren't just big, they were escalating. $2,000, $4,700, then $47,000 in a single shot 2 weeks before his retreat. And all of it tracked, documented, time-stamped. He thought he was being clever. But I had built systems for a living, entire neighborhoods, networks, grids that functioned silently beneath the surface until they didn't. Darren never saw it coming. Because men like him never think the quiet ones are watching. But I was, and I had everything I needed. The first message from Darren's attorney came 3 days after his email, the one where he stole my inheritance and sent me a sunset-like. It was a farewell card. His lawyer, someone named Philip Benton, requested a private conversation regarding equitable distribution of recently transferred marital assets. Bold, isn't it? To steal and then dare to call it equitable. I didn't reply. Instead, I sat across from my own attorney, Valerie Chen, who reviewed the logs, the banking records, and the lease agreement with clinical precision. "He's either confident or stupid," she said, flipping to the next page. "Probably both." We filed for divorce that same afternoon under grounds of financial misconduct and premeditated fraud. Not irreconcilable differences, not falling out of love. This was theft, and it would be treated accordingly. Darren, of course, tried to bargain. His second offer came cloaked in civility. He would return a portion of the funds and cooperate fully if I agreed not to press charges. I read that email while stirring lentil soup, the steam fogging my glasses. I didn't laugh. I didn't even blink. I forwarded it straight to Valerie, who drafted our counteroffer within the hour. Darren would return half of all funds removed from our joint accounts. He would sign a non-disclosure agreement barring him from discussing our marriage, my inheritance, or the nature of the divorce publicly or privately. And in return, I would agree not to pursue criminal charges. The next morning, Darren's new attorney requested an urgent in-person meeting. That's how I found myself seated at a glossy conference table, Valerie at my side, Darren across from us in a suit that didn't fit as well as it used to. His face was tired, hollow. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Valerie laid out the file, every login attempt, every screenshot, the bank transfer history, the notarized statement from our neighbor confirming a bearded man in a gray Tesla had dropped Kendra off multiple times while I was in Austin for a zoning conference, and then quietly, the apartment lease in Portland, his new creative space. Darren's lawyer froze. Darren just stared at the page like he could will it blank. "You think this is leverage?" he finally said, voice strained. "No," I replied, calm. "This is documentation. You know, the thing that makes lies inconvenient." He leaned back, rubbing his face. "This doesn't have to get ugly." "It already did," I said. "You just weren't around to notice." And with that, I stood. Valerie slid the agreement across the table one last time. "Sign it, or we go public. And legal." He signed. Quietly. His hand shook just enough for me to notice. I didn't gloat. I didn't spit fire. I just watched a man unravel under the weight of a truth he tried to rewrite, only to realize I had already published the final draft. The day I signed the final divorce agreement, I went home and opened every window in the house, even the one that always stuck in the guest room. The autumn air crept in, carrying dust and something lighter. Closure, maybe. Or just the absence of someone who'd stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as a target. Either way, I breathed. Easier. A week later, I listed the house. The one Darren and I had restored together, where every paint color was debated and every tile handpicked. It wasn't mine anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Strangers toured it on Saturdays. A young couple with a toddler fell in love. With the wraparound porch, I handed over the keys without flinching. Then I moved into a loft apartment above a coffee shop near Union Station. 2 bedrooms, one for sleeping, one for dreaming. The walls were brick and the floors creaked in comforting ways. No shared closets, no ghosts of arguments in the hallway. Just space. Mine. I sat with the trust account next. What had once been a wound now looked like possibility. I met with a financial planner and an education consultant and told them I wanted to build something in my mother's name, not a statue, not a bench, a chance. A door that hadn't existed before. By the end of the year, we launched the Elaine Warren Urban Futures Fund, a scholarship for young women from underrepresented backgrounds entering the field of urban planning. The first recipient was 18. Her application essay made me cry in the middle of a conference call. She wrote, "Cities should feel like home for everyone, not just those who can afford to be seen." My mother would have loved that line. Work became something new again, not just deadlines and permits, but purpose. I started teaching a night class at the local university, took meetings on park benches instead of boardrooms. I stopped apologizing for being too prepared or too intense. I was no longer building just cities. I was building a life that wouldn't collapse if someone walked out. And in the quiet hours of the morning, coffee in hand, blueprint spread across my kitchen island, I finally understood what my mother meant by build something that lasts. Turns out, she didn't mean a house. She meant me. The first time I heard Darren's name again was in a whispered side comment during a conference at the Denver Civic Center. "Did you hear about that sustainability author who tanked his own brand?" Someone asked near the coffee bar. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew exactly who they meant. His retreat business? Folded. The publisher he'd been negotiating with? Dropped him after the financial misconduct filing hit public record? His new partner? Yes. That woman from the sunset photo. Left within 2 months. Turns out, spiritual alignment doesn't hold up under court summons and frozen accounts. Valerie forwarded me the update. Darren's new attorney had withdrawn due to irreconcilable discrepancies in client disclosures. Translation: he'd lied too much and no one wanted to clean it up. Meanwhile, I kept everything, every cent of the trust, every asset he tried to touch. My home may have changed, but my footing was solid. And while Darren's world unraveled, I just kept building. Quietly, consistently. No press releases, no revenge speeches, just growth and peace. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late March, a plain white envelope arrived at my apartment. No return. Address. Inside was a check for $93,500, the exact balance of what Darren still owed from the joint accounts he had siphoned before the divorce. No letter, no apology. Just one handwritten line on a small yellow sticky note. The rest. Not. Just the money. No signature. But I knew the handwriting. I stared at it for a while. Not out of sentiment, but recognition. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't trying to repair anything. That check wasn't an olive branch. It was surrender. It was the only version of accountability he was capable of. Cold, delayed, incomplete, but real. And honestly, it didn't matter. I'd already won. Not because I got the money, not even because I held the truth. I'd won because I never had to burn the house down to prove it was mine. I just walked out and built a better one. The rooftop was quiet except for the soft clinking of glasses and the low murmur of a jazz trio in the corner. Denver's skyline stretched behind me, golden in the late spring light, like the city itself had come to witness something. I stood near the edge, not to look down, but to look back. Tonight wasn't just the Elaine Warren Urban Futures Fund's first scholarship ceremony. It was the first time in years I felt whole in my own skin. No shadows from a former life. No fear that something would be ripped away the moment I let myself exhale. The scholarship recipient, Ava, a first-gen college student whose father laid bricks on buildings I once helped design, hugged me like I'd handed her a passport to a different world. And in a way, I had. But what she didn't know was this. She'd given me something too. Proof that the ashes I rose from could be repurposed into foundations stronger than anything I'd built before. A few of my colleagues stood nearby. My students, city officials, even my old professor who once told me, "Women like you don't get to make mistakes." He was wrong. I had made mistakes. I trusted the wrong man. I ignored my gut. But I didn't let any of that define the rest of me. I learned, I recalibrated, and I rebuilt. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with legacy. As the sun dipped behind the Rockies, casting long amber shadows across the rooftop, I raised my glass to the crowd. To every woman who was underestimated, misunderstood or erased, I said, may you always remember, you were never broken. They just weren't ready for your blueprint. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was honest. And in that moment, I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. If this story touched something deep in you, If you've ever rebuilt yourself from betrayal or turned silence into strength, don't scroll past. Leave a comment. Subscribe to hear more stories of resilience. Like if you believe legacy is the best kind of justice. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't loud. It's standing tall in the house they said you couldn't build.